HRN listeners. As we celebrate our 15th year, we are deepening our commitment to giving voice to the next generation of food systems storytellers, and we need your help. Our internship and fellowship programs help activate new possibilities for underrepresented and underestimated young people through experiential journalism, audio engineering, and production training. Through these unique programs, HRN helps food equity stewards build essential workforce readiness skills that expand their potential and foster economic mobility. Please consider supporting these critical programs. And with a minimum donation, you can be entered to win a dinner for two at an amazing restaurant in one of 8 cities and tickets to a concert at a great venue in one of those cities. We have incredible partners across the country who have donated, as they also share our passion for helping to educate the next generation of food systems storytellers. Check out heritageradionetwork.org/15 to donate and enter to win today. That's heritageradionetwork.org/15 to donate and enter to win today. And make sure you donate before March 31st. Thank you.
This episode is brought to you by Appeal. Appeal is a plant-based protective layer that helps produce last up to twice as long. Learn more at appeal.com.
This week on Meat and Three, we're spotlighting the people, dishes, and ingredients decolonizing food. We're looking at our Thanksgiving plates and beyond to explore efforts to reclaim food sovereignty in Native American culture, the African diaspora, and Puerto Rico.
I believe that oyster dressing is like the consummate side dish for an amazing fried turkey.
What we're doing there is just working the land, and we're laughing, and we're creating a space for joy. And it's in that healing occurs for us.
Tune in to Meat and Three, HRN's weekly food news roundup, wherever you get your podcasts.
All right, hello, this is Lisa Held, and you're listening to The Farm Report, a Heritage Radio Network show about the people, processes, and policies that shape how food is produced today. My guest today is Tom Philpott. He is one of the most renowned journalists in the country covering the intersection of food, agriculture, and the environment. I could not be more excited to have Tom on the show, as he is somebody who covers a lot of what I do, and it's just really exciting to talk to somebody doing something similar. He's currently the food and agriculture correspondent for Mother Jones and previously worked as a writer and editor at Grist. And he's here today to talk about his new book, Perilous Bounty, The Looming Collapse of American Farming and How We Can Prevent It. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Lisa.
As you heard me say, I'm so excited to have you, and also want to say congratulations on the book release. It's kind of a crazy year to have a book coming out, I would imagine.
It is. It makes it in some ways a little bit easier because everything I do is via, like sort of bookstore appearances are all via Zoom. So none of this, crazy traveling. But
right.
So I in some senses I'm happy about that, but in other senses it would be, be good to get out there a little bit more and, talk to people about the book face to face. Yeah.
Well, we'll do what we can in this radio format for now. So one reason I just finished the book, and one reason I think it's really important is that generally when we talk about the ways in which the food system causes ecological destruction, whether it's in the form of water pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, soil degradation, all of these things, defenders of industrial agriculture will say these impacts are inevitable because we have to feed the world. There's a sense that they're necessary evils in order to produce enough food, right?
Yeah.
But your kind of central thesis is that this way of doing things, producing as much as possible in these efficient, centralized systems, actually threatens our ability to feed the world. Why?
Yeah, I mean that is like this central paradox, and I remember reading something 10 or so years ago that really caught my eye. It was like the framing was, can sustainable agriculture feed the world? And if you think about a statement like that, it's like, well, can unsustainable agriculture feed the world, and for how long? And when you
Right.
look at sort of what makes the kind of agriculture we do unsustainable, the answer that you get is, well, not for very long, because, as I show in the book, in the places, I focus on two places, but this really, the California Central Valley and the Corn Belt centered in Iowa. But it's really true of any place you look at where agriculture gets really intensive. There are many places in the country like that, many places in the world. Essentially, what you end up doing is consuming the very resources that make it a great place to grow food in the first place. And when you've done that, then you've tapped out this resource and you're not feeding the world anymore. And so I think that that is something that we have to grapple with, and I hope my book makes people think a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I really like that framing that you use too, because it's kind of funny how it's just another example how the word sustainable is kind of meaningless at this point. Because wouldn't that be the whole, like, if it's sustainable, it has to feed the world, because the whole point is that it's going to continue to sustain us, right?
Exactly.
Like, it's kind of a crazy, we sort of just use that word to mean something kind of incomprehensible at this point. So you talk a lot about the Midwest and the corn, soy, hog systems and the effects of nutrient losses there, which I know more about and I've covered a little bit over the years. But I was genuinely shocked by your reporting on water in California, especially in the Central Valley. Let's talk a little bit about that. The flood, the Great Flood of 1862. When did you first hear about that?
I first heard about it when I was first digging into the research for the book. So I'd already decided on the two areas, and I had done a bunch of work on California droughts. I think the drought probably had just ended when I was sort of digging into the research around the book. And I was just astonished to find that in addition to there being the threat of bigger and longer and more severe droughts going forward, almost completely baked into the cake by climate change, there paradoxically is also the threat of a massive mega flood that is really hard to get our minds around the scale of. And there's actually a precedent that is largely forgotten, and that is the California flood of 1861-62. So what happens, basically what happens is it starts raining in December in 1861 on the entire west coast of the United States, and doesn't stop for 40 days and 40, literally out of the Bible, like a biblical flood, 40 days and 40 nights. And so I heard about it and I was like, there is some work being done on it in California. There's a great academic named Lynn Ingram. She's a professor of paleoclimatology at Berkeley. And I started digging into this entire world, and I, came away from it fascinated and terrified.
Yeah. Well, and the research that you mentioned, it seems like there is quite a bit happening, and that they're, finding a lot of evidence that the likelihood of another flood of this magnitude is quite high. And I mean, I hadn't heard that ever. Why do you think that that hasn't been more widely reported?
Yeah, I mean, because, just so we make sure the listeners understand the scale. So we're talking about a flood that could put the entire Central Valley, which stretches from, not that far north of Los Angeles, up to the northern border of the state, toward the Oregon border. So you're talking about, 300-mile long territory, 50, 60-mile wide territory, under, 20 feet of water, in an area that in 1861 was pretty sparsely populated. There weren't urban centers there. There were Native American populations who actually fled before the flood really developed. Versus today where you've got Fresno and Stockton and all of these fast growing cities. And so I think, the question of why isn't this more famous, I think it's just harder to envision something like that happening, where we can envision earthquakes because they happen with some regularity out there. And, anyone who was born, anyone who was born after 1980 can remember, the massive earthquake that happened in California. I'm sorry, in the Bay Area. But it's hard. I mean, this is something out of a disaster movie. And I think it's just really hard to think about it in a concrete way. And so people just don't think about it.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of typical of some of these things we try to talk about when we talk about climate change, the climate crisis. Some of the impacts are just so hard to even imagine, right? There's like a cognitive dissonance that's like you can't even fathom something of that magnitude. Yeah. And, you mentioned how large the Central Valley is and what would be affected if a flood of this size were to happen again. What would that mean for the food system based on the reporting you did?
Yeah. So, I mean, you just have to think about how much food we get from that region, from that sort of bowl in the middle of California. And, it's something in order of like a fifth or a quarter of the food that we eat in this country, fruits and vegetables, nuts, huge amounts of milk come from there. There's beef production. It's the biggest milk production. California is the biggest milk producing state. And most of the milk production happens in the Central Valley. It happens in California. And so, you're talking about an incredible disruption in, that year's crops that would, there would be a scramble to make up for it. There would definitely be higher prices. There'd be a scramble to import. And then you're also talking about millions and millions of dollars in investments made in things like almond groves, pistachio groves. These are investments that people make that take place over 25 years. They're very expensive to put in. And so, you're talking about potentially killing off, this massive base of almond and pistachio groves. And then, something else that you got to think about is all of the farm chemicals, all of the manure from this, we're talking about giant industrial scale milk factory farms, factory dairy farms, all of that material, getting taken up into water, and then as it dries up, just sort of sinking. Think of all the pesticides and fertilizers that are always on hand in an area like that. And it's like the academics who modeled out what a storm would look like really did not get much further than to sort of gape at what could possibly happen. And I think, once again, this is just like, how do you model something like that? Like, has there, something like that really hasn't happened in the modern world where possibly that one of the 2 or 3 most industrialized agriculture centers on the globe coming under 20 feet of water. So it's really hard to model. But what we can say is that it would completely screw things up for many years in one of the key nodes of food production in the United States and in the world.
Right. Well, and I guess, another reason maybe more attention isn't paid to this is, as you document in the book, the problem of drought is so front and center and present that the region is dealing with that on a daily basis and trying to figure out where to get more water. So maybe the idea of even thinking about the prospect of a flood is kind of foreign,
Yeah, that's definitely true. And there actually are some scary trade-offs on that very question, because one of the things that people want to do to make more water available to farms in the Central Valley is to build more dams. And
Mm,
that's not really a viable solution, because when you talk to water experts in California, the dams are like the good dams are already built. Like the places that are you know optimal for putting a dam, and especially a large dam, there are already dams there. Anything, there isn't a whole lot of more water storage to be wrung out of the area. But whenever you build them, you're sort of putting more pressure on a possible sudden, deluge of water. And so those two goals don't, flood control and making water available for agriculture are often competing goals. And of course, in the Central Valley, the push is always to, grab more water.
right. Yeah. So there's a lot happening in the Central Valley um, that we really all should be worried about. And so, but let's move to the Midwest for a little bit. So the problem that you focused on was really soil loss as kind of the foundation. Why did you choose that particular angle when looking at the Midwest agricultural system?
It's funny because it was influenced by California, because really the idea for the book germinated with California, just sort of like thinking about, here is this jewel of our food system, this linchpin of our food system, and essentially we're drawing down fossil water that can't be replaced in our lifetimes to feed ourselves. And there's this race to the bottom of the aquifer going on there that there's no good end to. Beyond the solution I came up with in the book of like sort of building up regional food systems elsewhere. And so
Mm-hmm.
while I'm contemplating that, and I was actually thinking about a book on California itself, just focusing on that area, I started reading about these big storms that were happening in the spring of 2013. And so, as you know, as a reporter who covers this stuff very well, I should add, as you know, after the harvest of corn and soybeans in the fall and before the next year's crop comes up, there's this period of many months where the ground is essentially just bare. And it's during this period where the Midwest is getting these bigger and bigger and more intense storms. And so so there's 2013 was a really bad year for that. There was massive amounts of soil loss, because essentially the soil just washes away, being unprotected by vegetation. I came across a scientist named Rick Cruz out of Iowa State University, and
Mm-hmm.
he was just sort of casually talking about catastrophic amounts of soil loss that, there were some years than others, but when you average them out, they're extreme. There's a situation where the Midwest soil, which is this incredible resource, is essentially being spent. And so I'm thinking to myself, well, we're drawing down fossil water in California at this, insane pace, and we're doing something really similar to soil in the Midwest. This is a real problem for our food system. And so that's sort of why, I had water on the mind as a finite resource in California. And then
Mm-hmm.
I see this other equally or more important region with this other finite resource that is also expending it. And, in both cases, these are the foundations of food production. Like, you don't have agriculture in California without abundant water because it's a Mediterranean climate. And you don't have, this highly productive agriculture in the Midwest without this sort of lush blanket of soil that, we encountered, American settlers encountered in the mid 19th century.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a interesting parallel, and I think it's also helps people understand kind of the varied problems or the varied challenges of producing food in different places. I think like we often don't think about how what should be produced where and how much, the climate, the soil, the water availability of a place matter when you decide what to grow,
Yep. That's exactly right.
All right. Well, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit about solutions. We'll be right back. This episode is brought to you by Appeal. Here at HRN, we care about reducing waste across our food system, from farms to home kitchens. We know that about half of the produce we grow ends up in the trash. We want to enjoy produce at peak freshness and reduce the amount that gets thrown away. That's where Appeal comes in. Appeal is a plant-based protective layer that helps produce last up to twice as long. It's edible, invisible, and imitates how peels naturally protect fruits and vegetables. Because here's the thing, less waste doesn't just mean we're throwing less food away. It also means we waste less water, energy, and other resources that go into growing produce. Appeal works with nature to reduce waste across the food system, from the farm to the kitchen. Appeal helps us conserve our precious resources to ensure we have fresh food to meet our growing needs. Appeal. Food gone good. Learn more at appeal.com.
The Stone Barn Center for Food and Agriculture will be hosting their annual Young Farmers and Cooks Conference virtually this year on December 8th through 10th. Programming will cover topics like mutual aid, regional grain economies, land management practices, and much, much more. Whether you're a farmer, cook, butcher, miller, preservationist, processor, or anyone else in the food chain, this conference is for you. Learn more at stonebarncenter.org/YFCC.
All right, we're back. This is Lisa Held. You're listening to The Farm Report. I've been talking to veteran food and agriculture journalist Tom Philpott, author of the new book, Perilous Bounty. So, Tom, we talked about a lot of problems that are happening in the food system before the break, and it can feel a little overwhelming. Actually, my first question is kind of, I am going to ask you about solutions, but I'm actually still thinking of another kind of problem of its own. But, you talk in the book about the kind of Michael Pollan-driven food movement. You mentioned it in the beginning and then again in the end, and how it's led to an increase in local and regional food sales, which, arguably can be good for the environment and local economies. But it hasn't really at all slowed business as usual in the overall industrial food system as we know it. What did you learn in reporting this book about why that might be? Like why that quote unquote movement hasn't had a bigger impact on shifting the bigger system?
So in the writing of the book, I also had because I've been doing this since I think I started writing about food politics like around 2005. So just a year before Omnivore's Dilemma came out.
Right.
And so that book casts a really long shadow, and it's kind of a landmark of, there was a before and after in that book. I think it really galvanized people to think about where their food's coming from, to, there's already a kind of a farmer's market boom going on that it certainly threw gasoline onto, sort of made it burn brighter. And so something else I did in the conclusion of the book was I kind of took stock of that movement and where it's gotten us. I was very much a part of it. Like I moved from Brooklyn in 2004 to a small farm in North Carolina. To
classic story.
Yeah, very, very, very classic story. A small farm in Appalachia, North Carolina, because I was really interested in food and where it came from and being part of a movement to change things. And, I was in a CSA in Brooklyn before that, a community gardener. And so, what I realized is that, Pollan talked about a marketist movement and voting with your fork 3 times a day as transformational techniques. Like, we are going to, as consumers, we're going to band together and transform this. And, a bunch of people took up the call, and that there has been this explosion of farmers markets. But I think what it's, as you say, industrial agriculture proceeded apace. All these companies that I talk about in the book, your Monsanto's, which got bought by Bayer, all these companies, minted millions of dollars for their shareholders over the same period. All the problems that you and I write about continued, the sort of, dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico.
Right.
And, all of these, features that we write about, everything continued. Exploitation of labor in the food system, the veil of that ripped off by the coronavirus crisis. And so what I realized is that the sort of consumer, in an incredibly unequal society where there's so much income inequality and wealth inequality, that you've got a relatively small set of consumers who can afford to vote with their forks and make, quote unquote, make better decisions. It's going to lead to a very, very limited response. And this is something that I was actually writing about in the mid-2000s when I first got into it, that there was a danger of, instead of transforming the industrial food system, what we'd achieve would be to create 2 food systems. This one that is very nice if you're able to live inside it. If you're able to live by Grand Army Plaza in Brooklyn and shop at the Brooklyn, Park Slope Food Co-op, it feels like you live in this transformed world. But that ends up being a food system primarily for fairly well-off people. And by having an alternative, you're almost even strengthening industrial food system, because you're sort of like letting off steam. You're channeling discontent with it in this other direction. And, I just realized that that's essentially, in the writing of this book, that's essentially what we've done. We've created 2 food systems, and now is the time to work on transforming the dominant food system. And, where I end up in the book is that that's going to require social movements. It's going to require, not just voting with your fork, but also voting with your feet, getting out in the street, because these companies that profit from it are smart, and they, take some of their profits and invest it in lobbying and campaign finance, and they really have a stronghold on the political system. And that ends up what we have to transform. So I just feel like, I just concluded that we came to the limits of the Michael Pollan revolution.
Yeah. Well, and you seem pretty optimistic about the power of the vote in the end, of voting, with your vote, not your fork. I was kind of surprised by that. I'm maybe more of a pessimist. I feel like, under every administration of the last several decades, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, the Farm Bill has largely remained the same and propped up the system that we're talking about. How will voting with your vote potentially lead to a change in this system?
Well, yeah, I finished my book at a very particular moment in the American drama, and that was that 5-minute period when Bernie Sanders was, actually, I think when I finished it, Bernie Sanders had a lot of momentum and Liz Warren had a lot of momentum. And Joe Biden was scraping bottom. And so it seemed like maybe one of those two, both of them had really transformative, ag agendas that they were putting out. They both did very well in Iowa. I think that was right around the time I was finishing up. And so, it did seem for that moment. And I think now we are right back in the middle of where you're talking about, especially, also with Congress. And I think that what is going to be required is social movements. And I just want to give a quick example. And that is that in India right now, today, the government, they've got a very right-wing kind of Trumpist government. And one of the things that governor, that Prime Minister Modi is doing is he's putting into effect some neoliberal reforms to agricultural policy that is basically going to it's basically going to harm literally millions of small scale and medium scale farmers. And they are, these are very different situations because our farming populations are rounding error. It's like less than 2% of our population. There it's much, much, much higher. So I'm not saying these are parallel situations.
Right.
But their farming sector, their small and mid-scale farms, non-industrial scale farms, have formed a movement, and they are literally blocking traffic. They've marched to the Capitol and are blocking traffic and are in a standoff with the cops. And Prime Minister Modi has not very much choice but to figure out some way to compromise with them. And I think that is the sort of thing that, okay, we don't have the farm population to do that. Like if every one of our farmers marched on Washington, if the same percentage of our farmers marched on Washington as their farmers are marching on their capital, it would be a tiny number.
Yeah.
But we as people, because we have a stake in the food system, we have a stake in having a healthy farm system, those are the kinds of things that we're going to have to do. We're going to have to make, if you're a politician in Washington, you've got pressure from this lobby and that lobby, and you've got pressure from the population in your state or your district who are voting for you. And the voting pressures tend to be pretty light compared to these special interests. And we need to add another interest into the soup there, and that is, political action, social movements, people getting out on the street. I really believe this. I think that any gains that we get in climate change are going to be because there's been a climate movement, and I think that climate change and food are the same issue. Really, food is part of the same issue as climate change, and a broader climate movement demanding solutions, demanding the end of business as usual is what it's going to take. And I know that in the U.S. context, that's very far-fetched. But then I also think about, in the last decade, Occupy Wall Street, 2 major Black Lives Matter uprisings,
right?
Many union uprisings, Chicago teachers unions. We have seen political action in the streets making change here, and I think that the food system's going to have to food system reformers are going to have to take a lesson from that.
Yeah. Do you think it matters that in the U.S. there's so much division? Seems like maybe the wrong word, but to me it does feel like that farmers are not united in terms of their interests. Like it sometimes, we're talking about farmers' interests, we're talking about farmers who are kind of aligning themselves with the interests of corporate agribusiness, right? And then other times it's, the interests of a small dairy farmer in Vermont who has 100 cows. And it's like, it's hard to see kind of a coming together of people around this issue because the thinking and the is so different depending on who the farmer is.
Yeah, and also it also has to be said that what Modi is trying to do in India was done here 100 years ago. Basically clearing the land of farmers and consolidating farmland into fewer and fewer, larger and larger hands.
So those interests exist there too. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's hard for us to have an agrarian movement like they have in India or like they have in a place like Mexico because essentially we've destroyed our agrarian economies. And so that's why in the United States farmers have to have a role, but it can't be just farmers because we've essentially cleared the land of farmers. And that's one of the problems we have to solve. But it's going to have to be a much broader movement than that.
Yeah, that makes sense. So before we wrap up, I just want to ask, we're talking about solutions, and, your book is called Perilous Bounty. And I guess maybe, sort of the flip side of perilous would be resilient.
Yes.
What does, based on, reporting this book and all of your reporting over the years, what does a resilient food system look like? Like, what's sort of the foundation, do you think, of a system that is resilient rather than perilous?
I mean, I think one of the themes of my book is the simplification of agriculture, the sort of narrowing of the kind of crops you grow, of moving, in the case of California, this sort of big push into this highly mechanized, water-intensive almond farming, and obviously in the Midwest, it's sort of paring away of all other crops besides corn and soybeans. And so I think the basic principle would be to move towards diversity, to move towards more crops, more.
Yeah.
In the Midwest, they obviously need to add a third and a fourth crop into the rotation and bring animals back to the land. In California, I think they need to. I think if I were running California agriculture, I would say, look, let's stop trying to conquer the snack market of Asia with nuts, and let's. We are one of the world's biggest Mediterranean climates. We do have these amazing water resources. Let's scale our agriculture down to the size of our water resources and focus on being this great regional source of, fruits and vegetables and dairy that's not done on an industrial scale. And I think that everywhere else, as California, I think is going to have to, like they could do what I just said, or they could continue to butt up against the reality of, their water situation and also their groundwater legislation that passed in 2014 that's going to cause big limits on them anyway. And I think that we're going to see California receding as such a big source of fruits and vegetables, and that is a call for other regions to step up and build some redundancy into the system and start growing more fruits and vegetables elsewhere. And I think that is one of the victories of the farmers market / CSA / pollen marketers movement in the past 25 years, is that it's given us a great basis for that. Like, when I was a kid and when you were a kid, the situation with farmers markets was way different than it is now. There's way more to build on in every region of the United States than there was 25 years ago. And I think, scaling that up and using policy to figure out, hey, what do our region's farmers need to produce more food for our region, and how can we make those investments? But just basically diversifying the food system is the simple way of putting it.
Yeah, absolutely. Tom, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you all so much for listening to the Farm Report on Heritage Radio Network. If you enjoyed the conversation, please subscribe to the podcast, rate it, and share it. Until next time, this is Lisa Held. The Farm Report is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. For our freshest content, subscribe to our newsletter. Just enter your email at the bottom of our website, heritageradionetwork.org. Connect with us on Instagram and Twitter at heritage_radio. You can also find us at facebook.com/Heritage Radio Network. Heritage Radio Network is a nonprofit organization driving conversations to make the world a better, fairer, more delicious place. And we couldn't do it without support from listeners like you. Want to be a part of the food world's most innovative community? Subscribe to the shows you like, tell your friends, and please join the HRN family by becoming a member. Just click on the heart at the top right of our homepage. Thanks for listening.